Welcome everyone to Power the Votes Voter Protection 101 training. We at Renew are super excited to be co-hosting and actually just being here and being a platform for incredible voter protection folks. My name is Jen Brown. I'm the Training and Education Manager here with Renew US. And that is all I'm going to say, actually, because as a former VoPro person from the Georgia runoff election, I know how powerful voter protection is and how important it is to incorporate it in all campaigns. So with that, I am going to turn it on over to Power the Vote. And ladies, take it away.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Jen, for giving us an opportunity to be here today. We are so excited to talk with you about voter protection work and give you an overview of everything you need to know for your campaigns. My name is Kim Allen. I'm one of the co-founders of Power the Vote, and I also want to give my co-founder a chance to introduce herself as well.
Hi, everybody. My name is Syra Draper. I am another co-founder of Power the Vote. And Kim's going to let you know what Power the Vote is shortly here. But just by background, I'm an attorney and I ran the voter protection program in Georgia in 2020 and in 2021. Yay! And I'm also coming at this from a candidate lens. I have been a candidate, so I've seen the power of integrating voter protection into your campaign for running for office. So we'll be talking about all of those things.
Awesome. So a quick background on Power the Vote. Myself and my other co-founders led the voter protection program in Georgia in 2020. We saw firsthand how important voter protection is to flipping a close state. And Georgia wouldn't have flipped without that work. And it took thousands of volunteers and a huge effort to get that done. So we believe in the power of voter protection. We know that it can be the difference in a very close election. And of course, for many of you folks who aren't, running statewide campaigns, that's even more true because every election that you guys are running can be, decided by just a handful of votes. So this talk today is really important for getting a handle on how voter protection can help serve your campaigns and how it can make a difference for your candidates. We founded Power the Vote after the election in 2020 to take some of the lessons that we learned in Georgia and bring them to other battleground states. In particular, our mission is to fund and support permanent year-round voter protection teams in battleground states. We're fundraising to support the programs in Florida, Georgia, Arizona, North Carolina, and Texas. All right, so that's a quick introduction to us. I'm going to kick us off and give you just a general overview of what is voter protection, what does it mean for you? Voter protection at heart is essentially picks up where GOTV typically leaves off. So there's, of course, important work to register, engage, and turn out voters, but it does no good if they show up to their polling place and there's an 8-hour-long line. We saw that in Georgia in 2020. And it's also no good if they try to vote by mail and their absentee ballot is rejected, or they vote a provisional ballot that isn't ultimately counted. And so voter protection picks up where many of those kinds of efforts leave off. The mission of voter protection is to ensure that every voter can vote, that every vote is counted, and that every election win is certified. Why does voter protection matter? Voter protection prevents Republicans from choosing their electorate. We've seen that Republicans have been passing voter suppression laws that are designed to put up barriers to voters and, in particular, marginalized voters and voters of color, voters with disabilities, and others who could face challenges to voting. The mission of voter protection is to ensure that those efforts don't succeed and that voters are able to cast a ballot that counts. Voter protection can make the margin in close elections. We saw that in Georgia. We've seen that in other elections as well. Voter protection is important because it transcends politics. Voter protection is a key part of the Democratic Party and progressive brand. And the reason is that we're here to ensure that Americans can participate in our democracy. That speaks to higher small d democratic values. Those values, in theory, should transcend politics and should be shared values. And so when we engage with voters in a voter protection lens, we're engaging them on an issue that goes beyond just the platforms that we have as a Democratic Party, and in theory should speak to voters and resonate with voters, even if they don't agree with some of our politics. And then lastly, it ensures that America can live up to its promise of a democracy that is free, fair, and accessible for all. And so voter protection is important, simply for building the kind of country that we want to live in. All right, so I want to give you an overview of what voter protection looks like. And I will caveat this by saying it's a little bit different in every state. Of course, the way that voting is done in every state is determined by state law and by federal law. And so there is some variation across states. So we'll try to speak to the aspects of voter protection that are broadly shared across multiple states, and where we need to sort of caveat as to, what may be more state specific. But broadly, voter protection seeks to do three things. One is to resolve voting issues, and that's the job of certain programs within voter protection, like the hotline and poll watching. It seeks to monitor election administration and advocate for voting access. And then it also seeks to educate voters on how to vote and get information into their hands so that they can vote a ballot that counts. So I want to give you a sense of the overall typical structure of a voter protection program. Again, this varies by state. The top three programs here are poll watching, boiler room, and hotline. Those are generally shared across every state frequently, but although not always. But often, if you're going to build a voter protection program, those are the three core programs that you build. Poll watching sends out observers who are usually credentialed. They serve inside of polling places, and they watch as voters cast a ballot. They can address concerns with the senior-most person in charge of a polling place, and then they report back to the Democratic Party using a platform called LBJ, and they report back on issues that they see, on whether there are long lines, whether voters are being turned away at the polls, whether they're being inappropriately asked to cast a provisional ballot, whether they're being intimidated, or whether disruptions are happening to voting in any particular way. So that's typically what happens with a poll watching program. In a boiler room, the boiler room is usually attorneys and others who are kind of in a command center, and they observe the issues that come in from the hotline and from the poll watching program. They help to triage those issues and get them resolved. Sometimes they may coordinate with the elections office and make sure that issues get resolved in an appropriate way. And they also help to redeploy volunteers and otherwise manage the flow of volunteers to make sure that we've got people where we need them. The hotline is basically a place where voters can call in and where they can get help with voting. It's also a resource for poll watchers. They have the hotline number, and if they need to call in and report an issue, they can call the hotline to do that as well. So the hotline can be a place for voters to call with questions. It can be a place for them to call if they have some problem that comes up that prevents them from voting. And it's an important tool for ensuring that we give voters the information that they need, and also that we can react to issues as they come up. There are other programs that voter protection has been sort of expanded beyond, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the history of voter protection and how it's evolved, so you have a sense of like basically how voter protection is beginning to change over time. But one core aspect of voter protection is an election administration program, and this is in part an acknowledgement that voter protection is not just about ensuring that voters can vote, but it also is about ensuring that we administer elections in a way that comports with law and that provides voters every opportunity to vote. So nationwide, about 60% of election administration posts are either partisan elected or partisan appointed. And so there's a direct role that the Democratic Party can play in election administration under state laws. That includes, for example, in Texas, where I live, the county Democratic parties appoint the poll judges who are in charge of polling places. And so there's a direct role that we play in election administration. We want to make sure that we exercise those roles and maximize those roles where we have a role to play. But we also want to make sure that we monitor the sort of nonpartisan aspect of election administration. So sending volunteers to election board meetings to observe as they set the budget, as they set polling places, as they decide on voting hours, all of those kinds of things. We want to make sure we monitor that and that we respond if there's an issue that comes up in election administration. Next, ballot processing. So in some states, there's a process by which absentee ballots and other hand-marked paper ballots are scanned and counted. There's also a process where the states and the counties accept or reject absentee ballots and provisional ballots. If there is an opportunity for us to monitor that process, then that may be a part of the program where we organize volunteers to go and monitor that. And then post-election, there's quite a lot that happens. I know often campaigns focus on getting to election day, but in voter protection, that's actually just half the story. There's a whole process that comes after this. That includes vote canvassing and vote certification. The canvass, there's sort of the same word is used to describe different things, but typically vote canvassing is where they tally up the votes, they make sure that there's no discrepancy in vote totals. If there is, they investigate that discrepancy, and then they certify the results of the election. In some states, there's something called a vote review panel, which is what we called it in Georgia, or in other states, sometimes they call that a ballot board, or they may call it a canvass as well. And essentially, that role is adjudicating ballots. Often when you have hand-marked paper ballots, voters will write in a candidate's name, they'll cross out something and circle something else, and you need someone to decide whether and how that vote gets counted. In Georgia, the process was the voter's intent had to be clear. And if the voter's intent was clear, then you could count the vote the way the voter intended. But those are different state laws that determine how that gets done. So it's very important. In Georgia, we had a 3-member panel, 1 Republican appointee, 1 Democratic appointee, and then someone from the elections office. And we wanted to make sure that we had someone on those panels to make sure that the ballots were adjudicated according to Georgia law. So that's another important part of the process that often continues after Election Day, because absentee ballots could be returned up to Election Day. And then there's a ballot cure process, which, you often have provisional ballots and absentee ballots that need something else in order for them to be counted. It may be that the voter needs to go to the polling place and bring a form of ID, or it may be that they forgot to sign an absentee ballot and they need to come in and sign it, or otherwise cure that ballot to make sure that it gets counted. That can be really important because often those ballots can make the margin in a very, very close election. So ballot cure programs are one important part of the process. Often there's just a limited number of days for those ballots to be cured. In some states, that's just 2 days or 3 days. In Texas, it's 6 days. So you can cure your ballot up through the Monday following an election. And then there's the possibility that once all the ballots are counted, that the margin is within a certain percentage that allows for an automatic recount or for a recount at the request of a candidate. So if that's the case, then there may be a recount, and we need folks to go and observe that recount and make sure, 1, that it's not disrupted, and then 2, that it's done according to law. So that's another program that gets organized by Voter Protection as well to ensure that those votes get counted. Oh, actually, I want to go back because there's 2 other things that you should know, which is I've highlighted in orange here, sort of external parts that are outside of voter protection, but that integrate with voter protection. Voter protection integrates with fields and campaigns, including by providing training to field teams, by reviewing field scripts and messaging, and then by facilitating an information feedback loop where they provide information on voting to you, you provide information to the program on what voters are hearing, what misinformation is out there, what questions voters are asking, which helps to inform how the voter protection program runs and how they reach out to voters. And then there's also an aspect of voter protection that we consider party building and relational organizing. They frequently coordinate with the county Democrats, in part because there are roles under state law that the county Democrats play. I mentioned in Texas that the county Democrats appoint poll judges. That's really important. In Georgia, they appoint the vote review panelists who adjudicate ballots. That's also really important. And they provide volunteers and provide a lot of the local infrastructure that voter protection programs rely on. So we view the local and county Democrats as a very important resource and partner in building these programs. And then there are also progressive organizations that that come alongside the voter protection programs, help to provide volunteers, help to spot issues that come up at the local level. And those are also really important for building the program and for ensuring that we have eyes and ears where we need them across the state. All right, I want to give you a sense of how, like, where voter protection has gone and where it's going, and in part because you guys are across multiple states and your programs may be in various places, and so I want to give you a broad sense of the range of voter protection programs and how it's evolving. Historically, voter protection programs have been defined by the campaign cycle. They typically start, sometime around 4 months before the campaign or even less, and these programs tend to be reactive rather than proactive. When you stand up a program just within those 4 months, you stand up a hotline and a poll watching program, which is a very limited focus, and you triage single voter issues as they come in. These programs have historically been very siloed from the campaign because they're stood up sort of last in the order of the campaign. And then the programs end when the campaigns end, which frequently leaves nobody there to do year-round work that needs to be done. The voter protection is moving more towards a proactive and sustained focus with an additional focus on democracy defense. These programs, and this is something that we hope to accomplish as Power the Vote, is fund permanent year-round voter protection programs so that we have folks who can monitor election administration year-round, so that we can organize around issues that come up. We can work on the off-year elections and ensure that we're offering voter protection support for those candidates and campaigns. And so there's all kinds of important year-round work that needs to be done, including also, of course, responding to voter suppression bills. So that's where voter protection is moving, although there's some ways to go. But where we hope that voter protection ends and where it's going is that it's a more proactive voter protection program that shapes the landscape, that it works to expand voter access by coordinating with Elections Office on expanding voting hours, expanding voting locations, and making voting more accessible for voters. We hope that the program becomes more relational and not transactional. And by that, I mean, a good voter protection program is rooted in relationships with elections officials, with county Democrats, and with voters and volunteers, and of course, with candidates and campaigns. And when you are working year-round in a state, you can build those relationships at a time when the stakes are low, and then call on those relationships when you need them in advance of an election. We hope that that takes out some of the transactional element of politics and that it encourages people to join voter protection as a movement and come alongside and help to support this work. These programs are more integrated with campaigns, and we hope that that continues to be the trend over time, so that the campaigns can benefit from voter protection expertise, and also so that these voter protection programs have eyes and ears on what's happening in these local communities and what voters are hearing. And then lastly, we want to move voter protection more towards an election administration and democracy focus. Historically, hotline and poll watching programs aren't really focused on election administration, or if so, it's a very small piece of the equation. But when you have a year-round and sustained voter protection program, you can organize around all of the issues that come up in election administration. And you also have more firepower to help leverage the roles that the Democratic Party can play in election administration. So we hope that sustained and greater investment in voter protection brings more of a democracy focus over time. All right, I mentioned some of this, but I wanted to give you a sense of what this democracy focus looks like and how this is evolving. We've seen, and you may have heard, that people like Cleta Mitchell, who is one of the architects of Trump's strategy to overturn the election in 2020, they're organizing thousands of poll workers and poll watchers and tapping election deniers to serve in those kinds of roles. So there's a concern that on the Republican Party side, we're seeing a movement towards election subversion and utilizing the roles that the Republican Party can play to subvert elections. We are hoping to sustain and build a movement on the Democratic Party side to counter these moves from Republicans and leverage the roles that the Democratic Party can play in election administration. And what's important about this is work that can't be done on the nonpartisan side. It might be ideal if election administration was entirely nonpartisan, but that's just not how it's done in America. So it's important to understand that state and county parties have critical election administration and voter protection functions under state laws. As I mentioned, about 60% of local posts in elections nationwide are either partisan elected or partisan appointed, but also state and county parties and candidates have the authority to appoint poll watchers who serve inside of polling places. And so that may be something that your campaign is interested in. We'll talk a little bit more about that and how you go about doing that. All right, now I'm going to hand it off to Syra to tell you more about how voter protection is integrated in with your campaign.
Okay, thank you very much, Kim. That was an amazing overview of voter protection. So yes, we're going to talk a little bit more about integration. And so you're managing a campaign, you have a million things going on, right? Why should you take the time to think about voter protection, to integrate with voter protection, to form relationships beyond what you're already forming? That's going to be your call, right? I mean, if your candidate is in an area where the impact, the voter protection impacts might be high, you're obviously going to want to spend more time doing that. But even if you're not, there's definitely benefits to integrating with the voter protection network and knowing who is doing this stuff in advance so that if a voter protection issue comes up, you know who to go to, you know who to talk to. And fundamentally, so much of campaigning and so much of GOTV is about how to vote, where to vote, when to vote, right? And as we will see in this presentation, just liaising with the voter protection team and talking to the voter protection team about those basics, those fundamentals of getting folks out to vote can really add to your campaign and help your candidate. So we have voter protection in the middle here, and we're going to talk about a couple of examples, how it can integrate with your field GOTV effort, how it will integrate with your communications, disinformation effort, political party building, and of course, constituent outreach and education. Okay, so how does your work integrate with voter protection? Those are the 4 things that we're going to cover. So VoPro's GOTV, how does it work with the hotline? How does it work with field and voter outreach? And how can your campaign work with voter protection on election day? And again, one of the first things you'll want to do is get an understanding of who is running the voter protection operation, what kind of operation it is, how big is it, right? Depending on where you are in the campaign cycle and whether it's a presidential year or not a presidential year, you may have a huge team that's doing this work and you can easily get in there and benefit from that work. Or you may have a very small team and you're going to have to say, well, okay, you're not going to be in these counties. Well, my candidate's in these counties, so we need folks in these counties, and you can advocate for you and your candidate, and that makes sure there's voter protection work happening where it matters to you. So let's go to the next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about voter protection as GOTV. So there we go. Yes, we've talked a lot about how voter protection can transcend politics, right? When you have a campaign that is giving good information about how, where, when to vote, people appreciate that information first and foremost. It's something that they don't have to do themselves. And I do think it gives your candidate this air of credibility. When they're just providing information, they're not necessarily saying vote for me. They're just saying this is how, where, and when to vote. But you are kind of saying vote for me, right? Because maybe your candidate's picture is on the materials or whatever it is. I will say, we had, when I was a candidate, we had flyers. We put flyers on folks' doors in the last few days before election day that had their precinct, with the address of where they had to go on election day, the times that they had to go. And I heard from constituents later that they had received, a flyer from our campaign, a flyer from the other campaign. Ours had that information, the other campaign didn't, and they noticed that and they really appreciated that. Did that matter? I don't know. But there's a reason to believe that it does, and it could make the difference in a close race. And again, yes, the building trust is incredibly important when you're trying to reach out to your voters and you're trying to, make the argument for why somebody should vote for you. Providing them the information that they already want is really important. Something else that we did, yeah, so another example, we had a situation during our campaign where a polling place that was typically open was closed. And so we spent a lot of time just sending texts to a targeted audience, the people who we thought would usually go to that polling place, and letting them know, A, that that polling place was closed, and B, where the correct polling place was. And that's something that you might see, you know, a regular campaign do, but not always. It's not always, especially in smaller races, it's not always something that's obvious. But again, providing that information so that people can get out and vote early, so they know where to go is critical. And it's not something, again, that you necessarily know that the broader campaign is going to do. So if it's something that affects, you know, your candidate in your area where you're campaigning, it's something that you can lean in on that the broader campaign would not necessarily do. All right, let's see. Voter assistance hotlines. Right, so this is something hopefully that is happening year round in your state, maybe not year round, but maybe around campaign time. And when you send canvassers to the door, people always have questions, right? I don't know if I'm registered. I don't know how to apply for an absentee ballot. I don't know where my polling place is. And maybe you've already prepared your canvassers to answer all those questions. And if you have, that's fantastic. But usually, you know, you're getting canvassers last minute. You may or may not have had the chance to train them. You always have the voter assistance hotline as a fallback. So use it. We, you know, encourage all candidates to put it on all of their materials. It's a place where voters can go to get the answers that they need. And again, it builds that trust and credibility with your voters. That's so important. Another way, you know, all of this stuff should be a two-way street of information. So we can, if you encourage, when you find out about things at the door, you can also report things to the hotline. And that encourages the voter protection team to resolve those issues and, you know, make it a feedback, a loop, right? So encourage those folks to tell you what the resolution is, and you can integrate that into your campaign as well. So it should definitely be a mutually beneficial relationship that you have with your voter protection team. Let's see, let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so voter protection. Oh, yes, what is my hotline? If you do not know what your local Democratic Party hotline is, you can find it here. If your state does not have a Democratic Party hotline, there is also a DNC hotline that can help and that has information, basic voting information about most states. There's also nonpartisan orgs that have hotlines. Sometimes that is a good option. Most of the time, though, we really encourage folks to use their state Democratic Party's hotline because those are generally kept more up to date. They have the most recent information, including if there's changes. You know, in Georgia, we were really specific about the information that we would provide. So we had 159 counties. If we found out there was a better way to vote by mail in County X versus County Y, we would provide that level of detail feedback to voters when they called in. So we just generally found that the state-specific hotlines had the most up-to-date information. And for that reason, you know, we encourage folks to include that hotline number, even though the other hotlines are nonpartisan. All right, let's go to the next one, please. All right, so field and voter outreach. Yes, thinking about how to integrate this voter protection messaging into all of your materials. So how to vote, where to vote, these are things the voter protection team is thinking a lot about beyond just the basics, right? We're also thinking about how do we convey this in a way that gets the maximum number of voters across the finish line. And I'm going to give you an example of that. In Georgia, like many places, returning your absentee, you can apply for your absentee ballot up until a certain date, right? And so, but if you apply on that date, it's often too late to return your ballot and make it count. So we never talk about that deadline and we never present it as a viable option. You know, in our materials and when we're talking to voters, we don't say the deadline to apply is February 1st, because if you apply by February 1st, you're probably not going to be able to vote. Your vote won't count. So we will give them another deadline that is earlier to maximize the chances that their vote is going to count. And that is the kind, we saw a lot of other organizations, mostly organizations from out of state, national organizations, sending information to voters saying, this is the deadline, encouraging folks to wait until the deadline. And that was bad for our voters. So there's information can be accurate, but it may not be helpful, is what I'm getting at. And your voter protection team has thought a lot about what information is both accurate and helpful. So that is messaging worth amplifying and worth talking to your voter protection team about. Also, if you have questions about your own materials and your campaigning literature, you can send it to the voter protection team. Oftentimes, they will look at it for you and make suggestions about how you can, again, provide accurate and helpful information to your voters. Yes, coordinating your messaging. Yeah, I mean, basically coordinating your messaging is so important. You don't want to have conflicting messaging when it comes to voting by mail, for instance. So coordinating with the Democratic Party, always helpful. Yes, giving your vols a voting fact FAQ sheet. So a lot of times, again, when your canvassers are at the door, they're going to be the ones receiving information from voters on the ground about issues on the ground. They're able to bring that back to you and take that back to the voter protection team, but you also can anticipate some of those questions and can arm your volunteers with information they can take to the doors. So that is a fact sheet that you can work on yourself or work on in conjunction with your voter protection team. But we already know a lot of the questions we're going to get. So being able to provide timely, accurate, helpful information at the doors is really going to help your campaigns. Okay, election day and VotePro. Right, so, depending again on the voter protection risk, you might think that you want poll watchers in the precincts where you have a campaign, right? So I would check early with the voter protection team and make sure that they have assigned poll watchers to those districts. You might even want your own people there, right? So you can work again with the voter protection team to make sure that your own people are credentialed to be the poll observers in the districts and in the precincts that you care about. You want to know who is there. You want to be able to get information that is relevant to your campaign. Let's say a precinct shuts down, right? Or there's a 2-hour shutdown for whatever reason, mechanical failure. You want that information. So either you want somebody on the ground there, or you want a connection to the folks who are there so that that information gets back to you. Yes, so that covers everything on this slide. I mean, look, especially when it comes to the recounts and all the things that can happen post-election, like you want to know who is on the ground, who is there, and if there isn't somebody there, that you get somebody there. So let's
just as one quick, I did want to just distinguish for folks the difference between poll greeters and poll watchers. Poll watchers are volunteers who are credentialed and serve inside of a polling place, and they are allowed to sit in the polling place, observe as voters vote, and make sure that the process goes smoothly. Often candidates and campaigns will have a poll greeter who is outside the polling place. Usually there's some buffer zone between the polling place and where the poll greeters can stand, and they can stand outside of that margin with a sign and say, hey, here's a sample ballot, or hey, be sure to vote for this candidate. Your poll greeters, if you have them outside of a polling place, need to be generally aware of some voter protection considerations, including there may be a Democratic Party poll watcher inside of their polling place, in which case it's great for them to know who that is, and they can send them text messages or just let them know what's going on. They can watch for and report long lines, including by calling the voter protection hotline and say, hey, we've got a long line outside of this polling place. Then the voter protection program can tell them, hey, if it's a place where there are vote centers instead of precincts, you can direct voters to go to a nearby vote center, or you can encourage people to stay in line. And there may be other relief that can be offered depending on state law. They may be able to send water bottles or other things to this polling place. You can ask voters how their voting experience went. If they had an issue, again, give them the hotline number and encourage them to call the hotline. They can watch for voter intimidation. Sometimes we saw, Republicans in their trucks with flags and guns pull up to a polling place and want to intimidate the people who are online. They can report those kinds of issues that come up. And then anything else that happens, they can call the hotline. So it's important for your poll greeters to understand that there are, some of those things that may come up, and when to reach out and call the hotline if there is a problem.
Yep. And when it comes to post-election day, I mean, we saw so many recounts and things of that nature where, again, it was really helpful to have relationships in advance, to make sure that your team was looped in if something was happening, or vice versa, the VotePro team was looped in if you knew something was happening. Because so many of these, recounts and so many of these things are happening for the first time, and they really do set a precedent for what is happening across the rest of the state. So having everybody involved from the beginning is very helpful. We saw different campaigns depending on the size of the campaign. If they were larger campaigns, have a staff person or a volunteer who is the voter protection liaison. Basically, their entire job was liaising with the voter protection team and making sure that the campaign's interests were represented in the broader voter protection effort. Again, depending on the size of the campaign, you may or may not be able or want to do that, but it's certainly an idea. Let's see. Let's go to the next slide. Well, that's an easy one. Are there any questions?
I know we had one come into the chat. So from Alexis, and thanks so much for this question, Alexis. Basically the idea is there may be some like a division or a faction within the Democratic Party. And I will say, we've seen this not only in places like Rhode Island, but also sometimes, in rural areas of some of these battleground states. There's a kind of, entrenched faction of folks who are pretty happy with their electorate as it is, and they're not super interested in a younger and more diverse electorate coming in and having their voices heard. That absolutely does happen in some places. And so the question is basically, how do we protect voters when there is some of this factionism within the party? One way is that in many states, I don't know if this is true in Rhode Island, you'd have to look it up, but in many states, candidates themselves can have poll watchers inside of polling places. So that may be one way that you help to protect voters at your polling place. Even if you don't have the authority to appoint a poll watcher inside of a polling place, you can absolutely have poll greeters outside of your polling places. And those folks can help ensure that voters are not intimidated, that they're not turned away. They can talk to voters and say, how is your voting experience? Direct them to the hotline if the voter had any problem, and help to get those kinds of issues resolved. So that's one key way that I think you can help make a difference. And, even as a candidate, and help ensure that voters get the information that they need. You can also sensitize your field volunteers, your canvassers, to some of these voter protection issues. Make sure that they have helpful and accurate information on how to vote, and that they provide that information to voters at the door. And that can also help make a very big difference.
Alexis also says here in the chat that early voting, I assume in Rhode Island, began here last week, and the new touchscreen ballot machines they were using displayed the names of candidates from 2018 on the Spanish language ballots, and 55 people had already voted before they fixed it. So yeah, that is a face palm situation. We have the face palm emoji here several times, but you would be, well, maybe you wouldn't be shocked how often that kind of thing happens. And one of the things that the voter protection team, especially if it's a statewide voter protection team, does is keeps tracks of these incidents and is able to assess the severity, and, in combination whether they may have had an impact on a certain election. You can imagine a situation where somebody loses by less than 55 votes, where this is very relevant information, right? So you may not necessarily, just being able to report this to a common repository where all of this stuff is collected and can later be assessed if something happens on the back end, is really helpful for the bigger picture. And then certainly if it affects your candidate directly, you'll have extra resources and extra eyes and ears to help with the issue if it affects you directly. Oh, yeah, there it is. Terrible. Any other questions? I mean, and also just, curious, we have, has voter protection been an issue that has been front of mind for you all as you're running campaigns? And, curious if this conversation has changed your thinking on that.
Well, I have a question about voter intimidation, and something that I hear a lot is that people feel potentially unsafe going to vote. So, I heard you say if you see it happening, then you can report it to the hotline. But I'm curious, sort of, I'm worried about the people who never go to the polls because they're worried or that they feel like they might not be safe. So, can you share like any tactics or communications that you found effective to help people sort of in advance feel that they will be safe if they go to vote?
Depending on the state that you're in, if voting at home is an option, that's obviously something that we can push, and we want to make sure that everybody knows that it's an option for them if it is, and then knows how to get through the process and make their ballot count. That can be tricky and has gotten trickier since 2020 because a lot of states have changed those rules about how to vote and who's eligible to vote at home. But that's certainly something that comes to mind, and getting out the information about when that application opens, when that window opens, when you have to get your ballot by, so that'll count. Like that kind of granular detail, very, very helpful, especially for folks that haven't voted at home before. And then what we've seen is that a lot of the voter intimidation incidents tend to happen on election day. So if your state has early in-person voting, pushing people to go early as a general matter is a great idea, but especially in those situations. You can talk to the voter protection team and see if they have historical data on what precincts have been affected before, to see if there's a history of that kind of thing happening. And if there is, the candidate speaking to the local elections office to see what they're doing about that is a really great idea. Some election offices have gotten security. Some have spoken with local police. In Georgia, can be an issue too, right? Because we don't want an overly policed presence at a lot of our precincts, right? Because that has not the effect we're looking for. So having those conversations early with the election office, whether it's from the campaign itself or from somebody at the voter protection team that has those relationships, I think can really be helpful for figuring out the lay of the land and best approach.
All great ideas. Thank you.
Absolutely. Just a couple of other thoughts. I have seen some candidates create videos on how to vote, and it's very county specific. It's very much like, here's what voting looks like in your county. And it gives people a sense, for someone who's never walked inside of a polling place, doing that for the first time can be really intimidating. You don't know what to expect. And so, giving someone a kind of visual understanding of, here's what you do. You go to your polling place, here's how you find it, here's the ID that you bring, here's what you can expect when you get there. It may be you will have a paper ballot, or maybe there will be a voting machine that prints out a ballot that you then stick into a scanner. Just walking them through the process and giving them that basic understanding can help to diminish some of the intimidation factor just from walking into a new place and doing something you've never done before. One reason why poll watchers are so important is that I do think someone's first voting experience can be really formative and can help determine whether they feel comfortable going back to a polling place and voting again. And sometimes poll workers don't mean to be intimidating, but they say something like, they remark on a person's name, or they remark on a person's accent, or they remark on a person's gender presentation and whether that matches their ID or not. And those kinds of experiences can be harmful for voters and can give them just a bad impression of what it is to vote and whether they feel safe and comfortable voting. So we're really mindful about those kinds of issues, and having a poll watcher in the polling place can help to mitigate some of that, prevent it from reoccurring. And also, of course, reporting those kinds of incidents helps us to do some work after the election to ensure that, perhaps one of those poll workers isn't invited back, or there may be other things that can be done after the fact. So just to underscore, the importance of poll watchers, There's also a lot of work that we did, internally in coordination with the elections offices to try to reduce long lines in 2020. And the result was that on election day, when certain, sort of election-denying types of Republicans turned out to these polling places to try to disrupt the voting, there were no voters in line to be impacted. So, again, that just underscores the importance of doing the work on the front end to try to reduce some of that, make the elections run more smoothly so that there aren't voters in line, and then there's nobody to harass and intimidate, which is a wonderful thing when it happens.
We also have another comment here from Alexis in the chat, commenting on a voter's experience. A voter who was blind was told he could not his wife wasn't allowed to help him vote, I guess, against state rules. And so that is precisely the kind of situation that, had there been a poll watcher there who was acquainted with the rules and state rules, that poll watcher has the right to speak to a high-ranking person at the polling place and can correct the issue as it's happening. So just to bring it back, you're running campaigns, you have a specific turf that you are covering, it is in your interest to have poll watchers in all of those locations during early vote, during election day. And if the voter protection program isn't already doing that, you talking to the voter protection program and saying, hey, we want people in these places. And by the way, here's a list of volunteers, people that have worked with our campaign that we would like to have in those places. That's something you can do.
I also want to mention this is one circumstance where voting at home can be a very good option. And even in states that have very restrictive voting rules, often disability is a good reason to vote by mail. And so this may be one place where voting at home could be especially helpful because, of course, then he can get that assistance at home. One flag is that often there's a requirement that if someone assists you in filling out their absentee ballot, that they are noted on the envelope as having provided that assistance. So that's just one flag to note, but that may be also a place where voting from home gives a degree of comfort and assurance where voting in person feels a little more intimidating. Maybe one other thing that we can kind of speak to that might be of interest to folks, and this kind of touches on the voter intimidation issues. We tried in our voter protection program to strike a balance between educating voters about voter suppression tactics and voter intimidation tactics, and preparing them for that, but then also not scaring them off from voting. And so in your communications on social media and in other forums, you want to be careful about striking that kind of balance. And so maybe, Syra, you could speak a little bit more to those kinds of issues and the considerations that come up.
I mean, you pretty much hit the nail on the head. It was a very case-by-case basis whether we were going to amplify any kind of misinformation by commenting on it, right? So we would, get reports of intimidation or misinformation being disseminated and just basically do an analysis of, how many voters it was impacting, whether it was having the intended effect. I mean, we had instances where, calls were being made, robocalls were being made to folks with the wrong election date. That's certainly something we want to counter, right? But, we wouldn't have tried to counter without, there were many instances in which we heard of something happening that didn't have the impact that it could have. And so we didn't talk about it because we didn't want to confuse voters with more dates or more nuance. So again, you as a campaign may make those calls, but it never hurts to consult with the voter protection team who is also assessing that kind of situation and figure out how you're going to align your messaging so that voters receive streamlined communication.
Yeah, and often the kind of tenor of how this was communicated to voters would be something along the lines of like, heck no, they're not going to take away our vote. Something that's mobilizing and helps to energize people to fight back instead of demoralizing them and making them feel as though their vote is under attack. So try to strike that balance. It's just one consideration as issues come up. Any other questions or anything we can tell you guys?
Awesome.
All right.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for all you do to protect and expand democracy. And yes, we hope that going forward, you can integrate voter protection even more so than you are already into your campaign work.
Thank you both so much. I will drop your contact information in our personal Slack as well as pass it along. And I want to say thank you to everyone who attended and also everyone that's watching. Really appreciate you. As we always say, go fight, win, and happy election season. Bye, y'all.